Even at the end of summer, the air south of Saint-Lô still carried a scorched, dusty smell. Tracks had chewed the road into irregular ruts, and charred stakes leaned in the mud like a row of survey markers broken off ahead of time. Klaus Hoffmann was forced to push himself up from the collapsed, shallow dugout, his chest still holding the dull thud of the last explosion. He could no longer distinguish the intervals between the shells nor judge the direction of fire. The front line had lost its shape long ago, leaving only a retreating trace that kept pulling back. At engineering school, he had learned to judge artillery range by vibration, but on this patch of ground, torn into strips by air raids, the vibrations had merged completely with the earth itself. By the time the order to retreat reached the pioneer company at dusk, the unit no longer resembled a working formation, but a scattering of iron parts, each piece trying to find its own way out. When Hoffmann was forced to stop amid the wreckage of the advance road, he briefly assessed whether the bearing capacity of the terrain could still support an infantry withdrawal. But no one cared about bearing capacity anymore. Everyone cared only about getting away. Being captured wasn't an event. It was the natural endpoint after a string of collapses. At daybreak, the gunfire stopped cleanly, and American search parties emerged from behind the tree line. There was no struggle, no token resistance. When Hoffmann raised his arms, he felt the dry dust clinging to the skin inside his gloves, that familiar smell of engineer work, now mixed with the scent of a collapsing front. He realized that his engineering training had become useless here. All calculations had gone hollow on a battlefield sliding out of order. From France to Britain, then across the Atlantic to the United States, he remained in a kind of mechanical tautness. POW status meant removal from the front, but his body still kept frontline rhythm, instinctively tightening his abdominal muscles when steel bulkheads rang, quickly estimating the source of weight when metal chains slid. These reflexes were like fragments of combat residue, stuck to his nerves and impossible to peel away. On the morning they arrived at the POW camp in Iowa, the air smelled faintly of grain that hadn't fully dried. The wind had a clean, steady direction, utterly unlike the air currents of the European theatre, always mixed with powder and the stench of wet soil. Hoffmann received his temporary number at the camp distribution, and the next day was assigned to an outside labor detail on a mid-sized farm. The sergeant in charge only repeated the line from the orders. The farm was short of labor and needed manpower. As the truck bumped along the farm's dirt road, Hoffmann had already begun silently observing the ground, the depth of wheel marks, the shoulder slope, the moisture in the soil. That was a professional habit left by his training. He still read the environment as a structural body that could be analyzed. He noticed the stubs of corn stalks scattered by the roadside. The cuts were clean, as if made by powered machinery rather than hand harvesting. At that moment, a phrase from pre-war propaganda about American industry flickered through his mind. U.S. agriculture depended on clumsy machinery, with inflated efficiency and wasteful fuel use. An engine started up behind the cluster of buildings. At first it was a low, pulsing thump. Then it stretched into a stable, metallic drone. At the first tremor, Hoffmann's shoulders tightened, his knees bent, his body reflexively lowering itself. He thought it was the pre-firing vibration of mortars, the sort of frequency that had foreshadowed night raids countless times in Normandy, but no shells came, no chain of detonations, just an engine warming up somewhere in the distance, spreading its vibration evenly. When the tractor rounded the barn, its yellow-green chassis looked dry and bright in the morning sun. The wheels were wide, and the white exhaust trailing from the pipe drifted backward, like a steady signal. Hoffmann stared at the machine, realizing that his reflex to drop prone was pointless here. He had never seen the enemy's machinery at this distance in this kind of setting. The escorting sergeant motioned for him and the other prisoners to disembark. The farmer waited nearby. He said nothing, only made his notes. Hoffmann was assigned to the field work detail, assisting with machine operation and pre-plowing cleanup. On the way to the barn, he still watched with an engineer's eye. Were the metal components symmetrical? Did the chassis bear signs of repair? Were there micro cracks from fatigue in the steering joints? All these observations condensed into a single goal: one he had quietly set for himself at POW intake. "I will use my training to verify whether American machinery is really as crude as our propaganda claimed." His steps left shallow impressions in the mud, his body not yet released from frontline tension, while the waves of sound from that engine pressed toward him layer by layer, a weight not belonging to the battlefield. The tractor stood idling in the middle of the yard, its metal shell holding the sun's warmth. As Hoffmann approached, he caught a faint whiff of gasoline, clean and consistent in concentration, unlike the adulterated fuel common at the front, which always carried a sour note from dilution. Following the lines of the chassis down, he noticed the mud spattered evenly around the hubs. That meant the centrifugal forces were well balanced, the wheels showed no sign of uneven wear, and there were no telltale shudders from off-center load. He forced down a familiar judging reflex. In pre-war German machines, he could often estimate maintenance status quickly from such details. Here, the condition was more stable than he'd expected. That stability produced a faint unease, as if someone had placed a piece of metal before him that he could not quickly read. Within the limits allowed by the military, the farmer signaled several POWs to help move equipment into a shed. Hoffmann was assigned to the tractor's side to help clear scattered branches and stones. As he bent down, he deliberately slowed his movements so he could bring his ear closer to the engine's vibration. He was listening for a signal he'd often picked out from German pre-war equipment. Aging connecting rods would, at certain RPM, give off a faint, off-beat tapping, a metallic ticking hidden inside the even waves of sound. But the Model A's vibration felt like precisely apportioned force. No more, no less. A rhythm that held steady without drift. He ran through the vibration in his mind again and estimated a rough frequency, then converted it into rotational speed. The result fell almost exactly within the range marked on the engine housing. That match made him pause. He had expected to find discrepancies, however slight, but there were none. The work detail was sent to the edge of the cornfield to help prepare the surface for the day's ploughing. As Hoffmann walked with the others, his eyes kept being drawn to mechanical traces across the fields. In the distance, another tractor moved slowly along, its tires pressing even patterns into the soil. He counted the intervals and combined them with the tractor's speed to check the consistency of its mechanical rhythm, and found another jolt. They had more than one of these machines. By 1944, Germany was struggling to keep agricultural machinery in service. Fuel allocation lines were breaking down, spare parts were scarce, and civilian plants were being forced into weapons production, a common story among engineer units. He had once seen a tractor in a farm repair shop stripped down to its frame, its parts taken to keep military vehicles running, leaving local ploughing behind schedule. What he saw now was the opposite. Multiple machines in operation, with no visible signs of desperate shortage. Hoffmann began shifting his attention from the machines themselves to the supporting system around them. Along the field edge, the seed sacks were stacked in neat rows, the outer fabric stamped with USDA inspection marks, batch numbers and growing region codes, all clearly legible. Picking up a bag of corn seed, he examined the stitching, a chain-lock pattern typical of automated sewing, not the hand-stitching so common on wartime German farms. He judged the bags had not been reused many times, their structure was intact. That meant a steady supply chain, not the endless reuse and make-do patching seen in wartime Europe. He pinched a single corn kernel between his fingers. The surface pattern was regular, with no obvious cracks or shriveling. The batch had clearly been selected. Half in doubt, he wondered whether the screening process resembled the hand-cranked sieves used in Germany. He bent to check the dust inside the bag. The amount was low, the granules uniform, evidence that both drying and sieving had been tightly controlled. He pressed a kernel into the top layer of soil to test hardness and moisture content. The outer shell's firmness was nothing like the wartime seed he'd seen doled out from German depots, where shriveled, worm-eaten or unripe grains were common. Closing his eyes for a moment, he let his engineering training reconstruct the chain. Selection, drying, grading, packaging, transport, storage. Such a process required a stable supply of electricity, machinery, and logistics to maintain. Meanwhile, Germany's railways in 1944 were under constant bombardment, Delayed shipments, cut-off production regions. Every engineer knew these realities. A dissonance began to pool slowly in his chest. He had been sure that American agricultural propaganda exaggerated wildly, but each step he saw contradicted crude and unreliable in every detail. When the tractor started again, vibration hummed through the ground. He instinctively planted his feet more firmly, shoulders leaning slightly forward, the posture that formed automatically before shelling. He knew there was no threat here, yet he couldn't stop his body from contracting along the grooves of battlefield memory. He watched ahead, waiting for the single blast that had accompanied this sound so many times in France. But it never came. The engine only kept delivering power, stable to the point of cruelty. In the afternoon they kept working, and he helped check plant spacing and watched the machines turning paths. Every task felt like another test of his old convictions, and every test failed to yield the result he wanted. Deep inside, he began collecting these failed proofs, unwilling to concede, yet unable to deny. He had hoped to find a flaw in America's machine system, even a small one, a bad weld, a misaligned vibration, an inflated yield claim on a seed bag. But each step instead laid out a coherent logic, a tightly functioning structure that seemed to be waiting for him to drop his pre-war indoctrinated judgments. Evening light slid down over the field ridges, stretching the tractor's shadow as it moved. Hoffmann stood among the rows, watching the flywheel spin over and over. Its circle showed no wobble, no shiver, none of the signs of a machine being kept alive past its designed life. It was answering him, without words. He realized he'd stepped into a question he would have to keep pursuing. If the propaganda was wrong, how wrong was it? In the second week, the farmer received a maintenance schedule cleared by the military, allowing POWs under supervision to help with routine servicing of the tractor. Hoffmann saw familiar entries on the list: clean air filter, check flywheel bolts, adjust ignition timing, lubricate universal joints. Before the war, he'd only seen a few pieces of farm machinery in the workshop, most of them old, heavily modified, their metal long fatigued. The situation here was clearly different. Once the engine had cooled, he finally had a chance to examine the Model A's internals at close range. There were no crude repair welds on the metal surfaces. The bolts were snug, still aligned with their original factory positions. He pressed his fingertips to the cylinder walls, trying to gauge heat dissipation from touch. The metal cooled evenly, with none of the subtle distortions caused by uneven heating from inferior steels, something he'd seen often enough on German machines built under downgraded material allocations. He removed the air filter housing. The element inside was dry and springy, not caked with dust as in frontline vehicles. The filter cap clips still fastened tightly, their threads not stretched from overuse. A thought flickered through his mind. This is a machine carrying a steady workload over time, not a tool being squeezed dry and starved of maintenance. He inspected the carburetor float chamber. The fuel was clear, with no sediment. He had never seen fuel this clean in late-war Germany. By 1944, most civilian fuel was cut with substitutes, murky and full of impurities. Here, the fuel was like the output of a supply chain that had never been forced, never diluted, never broken. Something shifted slightly inside him, but his engineering training pushed him to keep looking for problems. He checked the drive shaft for signs of uneven wear, running his fingers along its length. No gouges, no rough scoring, only a smooth, regular polish. That kind of patina usually meant stable load and adequate lubrication, a hallmark of a mature industrial system. Without noticing, his movements slowed. The deeper he went into the machine, the heavier the blows. He had assumed American equipment would be bulky on the outside, rough on the inside. Instead, he found the opposite: solid, durable, built around stability rather than flash. When the servicing was done, the farmer fetched that day's operations schedule. He pointed to the northwest corner of the fields, where high-yield alfalfa would be sown. Hoffmann was assigned to record soil depth, but his attention stayed fixed on the seed bag. The external labeling resembled what he'd seen on the corn seed. Clearly marked variety, drought tolerance, estimated protein content, germination rate. He slit the bag open, scooped a handful of seeds, and studied their shape and uniformity. Each was plump and oval with no shriveling or wormholes. The color was consistent, the surface smooth, as if they'd been through precise sorting. Trying once more to find a weak link, he compared the seed information to field conditions. He measured soil moisture, dug a few inches, and took samples. The stickiness, granularity, and water content all matched the recommended sowing conditions. He kept moving across the soil, as if hunting numbers that would let him refute the American system. But every measurement fell right into the prescribed range, not barely within, but snugly so. The sun climbed higher, and the tractor began cutting a fresh ploughing route. Hoffmann stood at the edge of the turned soil, watching its turning angle. As the wheels crossed the field, the earth flipped over evenly, with no sign of compaction or crumbling. He recalculated the towing torque in his head, and each time the numbers matched what he saw. He kept listening for the telltale whine of gears under side load on the turns, but never caught it. It was a pressure you couldn't see. Every attempt to fault the machine was answered with more stable operation. A few days later, he was assigned to measure corn growth. Walking the rows, he counted plant spacing, measured height, and observed leaf angles. He wrote down the numbers, expecting to find signs of exaggerated yield, stunting from overplanting, uneven growth, but the field was surprisingly consistent. Stalk heights varied slightly, but overall the plants were healthy, the stand density balanced. He compared the data with the figures on the seed bag: emergence rate, expected plant height, recommended row spacing, days to maturity. Everything lay within acceptable deviation. That evening, the wind moved through the leaves, sending waves across the field. The sound was clear and soft, like cold, quiet proof. Hoffmann stood on the headland, notebook in hand, feeling a nameless vertigo. His engineering training in that moment wasn't a weapon but a sheet of metal being struck again and again, its vibration losing support. He remembered how German pre-war propaganda had portrayed U.S. agriculture: wasteful, inefficient, unreliable, dependent on bloated machines. Yet what lay in front of him now was a stable system woven from land, machinery, and data, far more solid and harder to deny than the crude caricature he'd been Guéguo. Weeks later, the first corn harvest began. The farmer had the POWs load ears into the wagon. Hoffmann expected to see lodging, pest damage, or short weight, something he could point to as proof that high-yield seed claims were inflated. But as the scale under the wagon settled, the needle stopped squarely within the range printed on the sheet. He stared at the dial. The figure didn't jump, didn't wobble, didn't leave any room for rounding up. And in that quiet instant, the reversal finally landed. Not dramatic, but cool, slow, like a hollow space being quietly filled up by facts. Hoffmann suddenly understood that he might not be disproving American agriculture at all, but an entire narrative of industrial superiority he had once believed in. The tools of engineering he'd learned before the war had not failed. They were simply pointing him to an answer he did not want. The seed yields were real. The machine's durability was real. The stability of the supply chain was real. The only thing unreal was the set of givens he had brought with him. At night, rolling over on his bunk, he could still feel the day's numbers under his pillow. Closing his eyes, he saw again the flywheel's steady circle, the line of the wind in the crop, the scale arms sinking to its mark. Reality was pressing in, and there was nowhere to run. Late in the night, the barracks lights went out one by one, leaving only the silhouette of the barn in the dark. The air smelled of damp hay, so peaceful it felt unlike any theatre of war he had known. Just as he was about to fall asleep, a metallic clank rang out from inside the barn, the short sound of a chain slipping across a hook. It wasn't sharp, but it struck some deeply buried reflex with precision. His upper body snapped tight on the bunk, arms groping for the edge of an imaginary firing step, feet preparing to push off. The structure of the battlefield reassembled in a heartbeat. Metal sound equals signal before loading. Chain vibration equals mortar sliding into a tube. His body moved faster than his thoughts, as if dragged back to a night in France by old training. But no shelling followed. The ground didn't tremble. The air didn't compress in that way it did just before a blast. He braced himself against the bed frame, hearing his own breath go thin. This was residue from Normandy, still alive in the machinery of his body no matter how time moved on. He lay back down, but the calm didn't return. He knew his interpretation of sound was still locked in war mode, while the tractor's noise in daylight was beginning to fracture that mode, no longer triggering the impulse to duck, instead imposing a stable rhythm that pushed combat memory away. The next morning he was sent to sort metal fixtures in the barn. None of the tools showed cracks or patched breaks. Each hook hung at a height matched to its load, like a map drawn by calculation. As he worked, he noticed the even wear along the chains, with no sign of overstretching. The farmer had offered a regulation-friendly explanation. Heavy loads must be hung according to their weight class to extend chain life. Hoffmann listened to the content, but another meaning flickered underneath. This kind of rigor wasn't an exception. It was the norm in an industrialized environment. In the past few years, every German machine he'd handled had been under the pressure of scarcity. Lathes were uprooted and moved, factories driven underground, alloy content reduced, heat-resistant parts swapped out in desperation. Theory had been forced to compromise under the grind of reality. He had once seen a statistic showing that by 1944, average downtime for German agricultural machinery was several times the pre-war figure. In some areas, farming had reverted to animal traction. That was a supply chain being bombed apart, patched, and broken again. By contrast, the American farm was like an island of peacetime stability. Spare parts were available, fuel was clean, maintenance cycles were clear. Every machine kept the efficiency and service life it had been designed for. Hoffmann began deliberately placing the two systems side by side. He recalled a pre-war lecture where the instructor praised German industry's centralized efficiency, greater output from less input. Back then, he believed it signaled technical superiority, believed Speer's reorganization of armaments would lift production. The charts on the classroom wall had shown rising curves, sharp and continuous, suggesting that German logic could indeed support the whole war effort. But the details of the farms slowly dismantled that picture. Seed yields had not been inflated. Tractor power ratings had not been falsified. Fuel purity was genuine. Maintenance was orderly. Metal fatigue thresholds were higher than he'd imagined. Linking these facts, he could see two tracks. One was the actually running American industrial system. The other was the German industrial miracle, held up by propaganda charts alone. The contrast within him wasn't noisy, but it kept stretching, making escape impossible. In the afternoon, he was sent to the southwestern plots to help clear stubble from the last planting. As the tractor passed, it cut the earth into clean, parallel lines. The tires didn't bog in damp patches or skid on uneven ground. The engine output seemed to adjust constantly to the load, keeping the pull steady. He couldn't resist calculating torque transfer again, and the numbers kept coming out too reasonable. Then a thin cloud slid over the sun, the temperature dipped, and a film of humidity settled in the air. As he gripped his tool handle, he felt a slight clamminess in his palms, the kind of weather that, in Europe, usually meant a spike in machine failures. But the tractor ploughed on unbothered, as if anchored to a supply network that had always been there and never been broken. Standing on the field's edge, he suddenly realized he was experiencing a slow unraveling. Not of his faith in technology, but of his faith in German industrial superiority itself. He had never imagined that belief would be pierced not by speeches or statistics, but by soil, metal, and crops. Nor had he imagined that an engineer would be forced on a post-battle farm to re-examine the sources of his education, training, and loyalty. That evening, he watched the farmer outside the barn logging daily output and fuel use. The numbers were simple, accurate, free of decoration. Under pressure, German armament statistics had always been patched and revised, delays hidden, results inflated. But here, there was nothing to hide. The figures were just facts, naturally produced by well-run machines and steady supplies. A deeper question surfaced. If a single farm could maintain this level of efficiency, what did that say about the industrial scale of the entire country? Something in his chest began to give way. Not with a crack, but like a pivot point, slowly sinking. He remembered an engineer at a pre-war rally proclaiming that German machine building was the most complete, most rigorous system in the world. Yet in the late war, most of the equipment he'd serviced hardly resembled their prototypes anymore. Torn apart, patched up, sacrificing component life to keep running. It wasn't a technical failure, it was exhaustion of resources. The American farm proved in a quiet way. A real industrial system shows itself in daily routine, not in slogans. Night came. On the way back to camp, his steps left regular marks in the dirt. He hadn't consciously steadied his pace, yet it was more measured than before. Again, he heard an engine in the distance, the tractor's hum, low, continuous, unrushed. He no longer heard a herald of incoming mortars, but a sound he could finally identify. It was real, needing no justification, no interpretation. It told him, engineering does not lie, nor does industry. Lies exist only in charts and slogans, never in the land or the machines. For the first time, he acknowledged that the system he had believed in was collapsing before him in silence. When the air turned sharply cold, farm work tapered off. Machines were washed, wiped down, and covered in tarps, like entering a period of stored-up energy. Folding canvas by the tractor, Hoffmann pressed his palm against the metal shell and felt a faint warmth lingering after the wind. For 6 months this had been the source of the vibrations that accompanied him and the core force loosening his beliefs. He hadn't had a battlefield reflex in a long time. Engine noise no longer drove him to the ground. The clink of chains no longer made him seek the direction of shells. The machine's rhythm seemed to have rewired his response system, pushing the war's shadow outward from his instinctive reactions. He found he could hear sounds purely as a technician again, without scanning for threat. One afternoon, he was taken to a temporary hut in the POW camp. Allied technical teams were conducting routine questioning of prisoners with engineering backgrounds. On the table lay forms about German wartime production lines, explosive mixes, steel quality. When they passed him the papers, he felt an old hollow open up, not the hollow of fear, but the clarity of knowing his old beliefs could no longer be leaned on. They asked about German agriculture and light machinery, and he answered in the plainest way. Longer downtimes, shorter fatigue cycles for substitute metals, higher fuel adulteration, shattered supply lines for spares after rail disruption. He didn't use adjectives or excuses, just stated reality like documenting a failed machine. When asked whether he considered German industry to possess the centralized miracle lauded in pre-war propaganda, he went quiet for several seconds. The silence wasn't reluctance. It was a search for neutral phrasing. His eventual reply was flat, almost cool. Centralization is a structure, not a miracle. When resources break down, the structure loses its meaning. In that moment, he realized he had crossed a line. He no longer felt any obligation to defend the industrial myth. After snow, the ground turned firm. Each step let out a crisp crack. The POW squad was marched back to the farm for final seasonal cleanup. The tractor stood beside the barn, its flywheel under a tarp, as if asleep. Standing by its side, Hoffmann brushed the canvas with his knuckles. The shape beneath was still whole, like a kind of order that war had not managed to alter. The land was resting, the machines were resting, yet the system remained, stable and intact, not dependent on any single victory or bulletin. It depended on output, metal, fuel, and the structures that let them all run. This fact left an indelible mark in him. Light from the camp spilled across the snow, scattering into a gentle brightness. On the way back to the barracks, he looked once more toward the farm, its roofline cut by the morning light. The air was icy, but carried a stability he could now clearly recognize. He felt no urge for grand emotion, no grief for fallen beliefs. He simply acknowledged the reality with an engineer's calm, that this was a world larger and more solid than the one he had once thought he understood. The tools he had learned before the war, for judging, calculating, verifying, had not been destroyed. They had been recalibrated by reality. They no longer served propaganda or faith, only fact. As the repatriation column moved off, he heard the engine one last time in the distance. There was no echo of the front in it anymore, only the steady rhythm of a power machine. It didn't ask him to believe or deny anything. It simply reminded him in a constant voice, reality will not rewrite itself for any side. It merely lets misled beliefs collapse on their own. On that winter morning, Hoffmann finally understood. Speer's lies were not smashed in an interrogation room, but taken apart quietly and completely in the running sound of an ordinary tractor.